おはようございます。あ、すごい。練習しました。2 years ago, I showed you some examples from Rosetta Code. There are many programming languages on the website Rosetta Code, and many of the programs are in Perl, about 480 of them. And there are almost as many Perl 6 programs, and part of the reason for that is because I have been having too much fun, tanoshi sugiru, translating Perl 5 to Perl 6. Paru go, paru roku made. And here is one of the things. I just wanted to show you some of the things that I've been doing. This is a program called Strand Sort. And it works, it sorts a list of numbers by pulling out an increasing sequence of numbers. And then it pulls out another sequence of numbers that are all increasing, and then it merges those. And then it does it over and over again until everything is sorted. So, I would like to show you what this is. Now, I should turn off the syntax highlighting here because that's Perl 5. Let's see. Set syntax equals Perl. Okay. Now we have Perl 5 syntax highlighting, which is correct. So, what should we do first? Well, let's see. Obviously, since I'm translating to Perl 6, I really don't want the use there because Perl 6 already has the given when here. So let's. Oh no! Before we do that, there's too much indent. You notice it's wrapping around. So let's fix that. You notice I can type one-handed here. My Vim is very good. Okay, now just to prove that that is Perl 5, let's run it. There you see, it generates a random list of numbers, and then it sorts them into increasing order. So that's what it's supposed to do. Okay. Yeah. What shall we do now? Oh yeah. There's too much boilerplate in there, so we want to get rid of some of it. That's one of it. I've already talked about that. But also, you notice all these signatures. Perl 5 does all these shifts and add underscores. This line here. So instead, Perl 6 has normal signatures, so we can just put them there. Now syntax highlighting for Perl 5 is very strange, but we can fix that later. Okay, so we can turn this one into a real signature too, and get rid of that line. And likewise here. Now this one, okay, put this here. And since it's reading all of the arguments off the line, variadic argument, we put a star there which says suck up all of the rest of the arguments. In Perl 5, the default in a prototype is that everything is a scalar, or everything. If you put an array in a prototype, it will. Or in an assignment, it will slurp everything up. This is the opposite in Perl 6. It defaults to a scalar, and then you have to tell it specially to get all the arguments. The other thing about Perl 6 is that we don't have explicit references and dereferences. In Perl 6, everything is a reference, so we don't have to talk about references. So we don't need the backslashes here. And we can talk about, since everything is a reference, that includes an array. We can pass arrays by reference, and we don't have to pass them as a scalar and then dereference them. So we have explicit references are one of those things that is a little bit smelly. It stinks in the design of Perl 5. That part is my fault. Some of these things you see, they're the fault of the programmer, and some of them are the fault of the language designer. And I know who that is. So this one was my fault. But we can fix that. So we don't have to dereference these arrays anymore. So we can take those dollar signs out. There, and this one can change also to directly to same thing, getting rid of all the dereferencing. Okay, that's all of those. Now what? Well, another thing about Perl 6 is that you don't need the parentheses here around the conditional. So we can get rid of those. And it's still unambiguous. The curlies you still have to put. We made the opposite decision from C. But that's because in Perl 6, those curlies mean a real closure. Every time you see curlies in Perl 6, it's an anonymous subroutine, a lambda in list terms. So here's some more those parens. More parens that you don't need. Line things up. Oh, and now we can turn on, we can start to turn on Perl 6 syntax highlighting here. And it recognizes the keywords. Okay, well let's try running this under Perl 6. Now I'm going to be running mostly with a version here. I'm in the nih directory. So if I run that, la la. I will turn this one off. Thank you. You're going to get tired. Okay, so you notice it gives us a pretty good error message here. It says unsupported use of arrow as postfix dereferencer. Please use a dot or just nothing. So we can try that. Here's that arrow. If we turn it into a dot or into nothing, it means the same thing. We do the same thing to this one. And and here's one down here. And that looks like it's all of those. So let's try it again. Okay, we get a different error now. That's good. Okay, now it says that you can't use -1 as a subscript. Because that makes a discontinuity. If you accidentally go negative, suddenly you're at the wrong end of the array. So instead, we have a different syntax for that. So we change that to star -1, and that's star -1. Not that one. This one. Not that one either. Okay. That one. Just where we're using it as a subscript. Okay. Let's try it again. Okay. Let's do the first ones first. Variable x is not pre-declared. Did you mean add x? Oh yeah. We don't change the sigils when we subscript arrays. We don't change it to $1 anymore. It stays at. So let's see, where's that? Oh, right here. Okay. That wants to be an at because that's the name of the array. It stays the same in Perl 6. And it does not take long to get used to. You will want your Perl 5 code to start doing the same thing, and it won't. Okay. More of those, maybe. Yeah, there. Not there. There. Okay. Now, this is a little strange. It's counting up to -1. Oh, here's more parens. Here's parens. We can get rid of those. Okay. More friends. Okay, we got rid of those other error messages. That's good. Let's try it with, if I say Perl 6 without a dot on the front of it, then that's actually running Rakudo instead of Nietzsche. So, because that's the one I have installed system-wide. They're both very good implementations of Perl 6 strand. See, but it doesn't give quite as good error message. So let's see what we can do about that. In Perl 6, you write it like this if you want that. Well, it's one way to write it. If you want a random floating point number between 0 and 100. But actually, that's not very idiomatic. In Perl 6, we would tend more to write it like this. For the range of 0 up to 100, roll a dice, you know, a 100-sided dice, and do that 10 times. So that means the same thing, but it's a little bit more idiomatic, and it has a metaphor for how you think of it. And it's always it's integers, or whatever list is on the left, it'll pick one of those. Okay, so let's try that again, and now it gets very upset. Okay, and reading the trace back here, you want to look for about the first line of the actual program there. It looks like it's complaining about line 4. I don't know. Let's try it under Rakudo. It's still upset, but it doesn't get so angry. So it thinks that there's a problem at about line 17. Well, what's the problem up at line 17? Actually, before we fix that, notice it printed out up right here. It printed out before A. That's not what we wanted. We wanted to print out the list. Well, there's another difference here in Perl 6. We're going to debug this in a moment. That's why I stuck the exit in there. Okay, so whatever it is getting upset at is after that exit. Likewise in Rakudo. So, but in order to get it to print out the actual numbers, you have to actually subscript it in Perl 6. The nice thing about this is if you put an email address in double quotes, it won't interpolate at Google or at Gmail. It won't look for an array like that. So that's another thing that's cleaned up. Okay, so that prints out the numbers now. What can we do now? So we had a problem up around line 17, but we noticed that, first of all, that we're actually modifying at x. The error we had might be trying to write to a read-only thing. So let's look at all our things and see which things are read-only and which aren't. By default, a parameter is read-only, and there are two ways to make it writable. One of them to say, well, it's a copy of what's coming in. So here, we're making a copy of at A when we pass it in, right here. And if we make a copy, we can then modify it, and we see where the strand is modifying it each time through and pulling a strand out and making a smaller at X. So that's one thing. But strand itself is modifying at X in place as a reference. It's wanting to modify the callers array. So we have to write that like this. That says pass it in by reference, and then we can do that. Now another reason, and this might well have something to do with the reason it does not work right, is that the precedence of there's no named unary operators in Perl 6. They're all list operators. So you have to put parens here in order to avoid slurping up the or return. But we don't usually write it like that, in fact. We usually would write it like that because everything is an object in Perl 6. So we can call a method call on it, on an array. And we would call that, and then you don't even need the parens. Because methods default to not needing parens. So, does this give us a different error? Well, maybe there's still something wrong in there. Somewhere around line 20 or so. Okay, so let's see what we can figure out here. See if Rakudo thinks it's about line 17. So, what could be wrong? Well, there's this weird stuff going on in here with the counting up to -1. And you know, maybe Splice doesn't like to use a negative subscript. We don't like negative subscripts in Perl 6. So let's think about that a little. Let's instead do this star thing, but since it's relative to a negative number, we have to add it on there and see if that makes a difference. Well, what do you know? It does. It works. It might even work in... It almost works in Rakudo. Okay. So, but you know, this is just a little weird. Whoops. Anyway, yeah, it's definitely Hidari Mai, especially the slide. Okay, but it's backwards. I mean, it's counting up from negative numbers. Usually you like to count up from 0 or 1 and count up. So let's try that. Let's invert this whole thing. What this is doing is it's subscripting backwards into an array from the end. And we don't understand maybe why it did that offhand. So let's just try subscripting indirectly to the same locations. Okay. Now this idiom, 0 up to x, but leave x out, that's what the little caret there means. It's exclusive on that end of the range. That happens so often that we have a prefix operator that means the same thing, and we can just write that like this. So that means up to the length of x. And you see that all the time. And I'm tired of dollar underscores, so let's put that into a variable. So our loop variable is I. Let's try that. Ooh, something is wrong. It still kind of seems to sort it, but it has a bunch of uninitialized variables. Why is that? Oh, well, you look at this, we're doing a splice on an array. We're iterating over an array, and then we're splicing the array at the same time. So we're changing the index out from under itself, which doesn't work. It's two different it's a side effect. So let's make this explicit instead. So let's go and count up while, this is making an explicit while loop here. And and we'll only increment the I on the one side and not on the other. Okay. Okay, now it works again. And it looks like it works in Rakudo also. Okay. So what now? Well, boy, that's yeah, definitely screwed up my slide there. Okay, so but it's still kind of something strange here. We've got this okay, we're missing a lot of we're having a lot of inconsistency in here that is starting to bother me. I like to have semicolons on the end of every line if possible. So there's a missing semicolon. There's a missing semicolon. Here's another inconsistency. We're using return here, up here, but we're not using it down here. So let's just pick one way or the other. Both ways work. But I'd rather say return for explicit return early, like here. And this is more like a functional programming idiom to just put the value at the end. Well, what else? Okay. Yeah, the another thing that's bothering me is that this is written only for numbers. So, what if we want this to work on strings as well? Well, let's make a test case for that. Change it to a list of strings that we can sort into order. Okay, and what happens if we do that? Well, it doesn't work. That says unhandled exception, can't parse a number. And Rakudo thinks there's a redeclaration of symbol A. Actually, Nietzsche did too, but it was just a warning here. Okay, so let's take care of that first. So that gets rid of the redeclaration. Now, using strings as a number, we kind of know what that error is. It's going to be like this greater than or equal to right here. Well, if you want to sort it as a string, you have to have a GE right there, right? And likewise up here, this less than, equal, or greater to needs to be less than, equal, or greater. Well, that's what it is in Perl 6. You use CMP in Perl 5, but we stole CMP for something else, so LEG is less than, equal, or greater as a string. Now, it seems like it works, but, oh, no, it doesn't. Look. See this 5 right here? We sorted the numbers like they were strings, but we wanted to sort the numbers like they were numbers, and the strings like strings. Okay, well, how do we do that? Well, I told you we stole CMP for something else. Well, that's what we stole it for. Generic comparison. So it compares strings as strings, numbers as numbers. Whatever the type of the thing is, and Perl 6 has a much better type system than Perl 5 does. So it knows what the type of the variable is. See, I can't even talk my own language. So the way we write the generic ordering here is like not after, which that just means the same thing as not after. But we can write it with a bang on the front of it, and that's a meta operator you can apply to any comparison operator. So what happens if we run that? Oops, it didn't sort right at all. It didn't sort. It's kind of sorted strange, did it? Oh, well, that's because this is supposed to be not before. Yeah. Okay. Now that's correct. And make sure it works on the. Give me a. Okay, it sorted the one to the front. Good. Yosh. Now, but this. Yeah. What else can we fix? I mean, there's more. There's always, you know, magic numbers. Those are a smell. So here's a magic number that CMP returns. Well, we can change that because that's just an enumerated value, an enum in Perl 6. So we can say what it means, and it still does the same thing. Okay. Let's see, what else can we fix here? Well, that not before is kind of ugly. So we can just swap these two conditions, or the then and the else, and take away the negation. I don't know if that's prettier or not. It's different. Oh, here's another thing. Look at this. We have a while loop right here that says while I is less than the length of x. But if x is empty, it's never going to run. So why do we need this conditional here? Well, we don't. So let's get rid of it. Okay. So we'll check it. This is how I work. I go back and forth. I use autosave in my Vim, which when I suspend it, it automatically writes out the file. So I go back and forth very quickly to test. What else can we fix here? Oh, there's a temp variable here. Yeah, there is. Look at that temp variable. You know, temp variables are kind of a smell. They're not bad in imperative programming. You use variables all the time. And even in object-oriented programming, you use them some, though not as much, because you tend to go method dot method dot method dot method. In functional programming, you tend to go function, 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 function instead. But in functional programming, using temporary variables, usually the reason it smells is because it's a state variable. It contains state, and functional programmers don't like state variables. So, having to push onto this array every time through, it's easy to understand, but it's a little bit unclean from a functional programming point of view. Perl 6 has better support for both object-oriented and functional programming. And one of the ways that it is better at functional programming is that we have what's called gather-take. So we can put a gather on a loop here, and this says start, it's basically a coroutine. Start this coroutine and run this loop in the coroutine. And every time we get down here, instead of pushing onto an explicit variable name, just say, we want to take this particular value, and then that returns it to the gather as a list. So this function, like this, just returns that list of values without the use of a temporary variable. And it's a very, very easy idiom to get used to, and we use it all the time in Perl 6. It also starts to use, because it can be done in parallel, it's starting to use some of the syntax of Perl 6 tries to help you write parallel programming without having to worry about it, and this is one of the places where it does that. So you could like have this multi-threaded. Okay, so another thing here, notice that we have still got a reference to the temporary variable here, so it's not going to work. We're using it to look at the previous value. Well, why don't we just call it the previous value then? But then we have to go up here and say, okay, we have to set the previous value the first time before it goes through the loop the first time, or it won't work right. But then we also want to include that previous value in the list of numbers. So we want to say take that previous value as the first take. But that is, that's oops, because it's outside of the gather. So that won't work. Well, how are we going to fix that? We don't actually have to pull the first value, and all we need is a value that will compare as after or before any value that's a real value. So it turns out all we have to do is say negative infinity there. And so before knows that that's before anything else, even if it's a string. So that will work on both strings and on numbers here. Okay, sorts the numbers right. Oh, it's not sorting the strings right. Why is that? We will have to figure that out. Because we never actually remember the previous value each time through the loop. So let's remember the previous value each time through the loop. And still doesn't work. Okay, something else must be wrong. Well, it turns out that for technical reasons, you have to pull the zeroth, the first value of that list out. At least in Nietzsche. Rakudo doesn't. I haven't figured out which one's right yet. But this should make it work. Yes. And that was just a little bit weird. Okay, a little style thing here. In Perl 6, we can also use hyphens in the middle of names, like list does, and we tend to prefer that because it's easier to type. So let's just go with that instead. Okay. Now, there's a phrase called bass backward in English, which really means ass backward. And in, you know, in Japanese, hidarimai, probably the closest. Okay, this is like merging the lists, this merge routine, but it's doing it from the end to the beginning. It's popping them off the two lists and building the list back to front with unshift. I always think of unshift as a code smell. If I'm using unshift, something's wrong with my code. So, especially in functional programming, you tend to want to do things left to right if you can. And there's a technical reason for that, is because in functional programming, often you can have infinite lists. And, you know, infinite lists have a left end, but they don't have a right end. So, I mean, they keep going. So you want to do things left to right, and then you can be lazy about it and just do as much as you want. So let's make this merge so it goes left to right instead. Well, so that means we have to compare the first elements of the arrays instead of the last elements. We need to change the unshifts to pushes and the pops to shifts. And let's see, this becomes, well, you see it's going to get simpler already. Instead of splice 0, 0, we can just say push. And what else? Well, we have to swap the increase and the decrease because we're ordering in the other direction. We have to reverse the order of these down here because something might be left in X or Y, but it comes at the end instead of at the beginning because that's the order we're building the array. Okay, so that should still work, and it does. Good. So when you keep testing like this, whether just by hand or with a test suite, then you find your errors very quickly, and that's a good way to work. Okay, notice here's another temporary variable that we can get rid of. We're pushing to it. So maybe we can do the same trick with gather. So we put a gather on the front of this while loop. And then we do a take instead of a push. Let's see, what else? Oh, we don't have to take the number at the end. We want to take whatever is left in X or Y. So we put it there, and again, that's kind of an oops, because it's outside of gather. Well, we can fix that by explicitly gathering. The syntax of gather actually can work like a do block. So you can say gather block and not just gather statement. So we can just take this and put it inside like that. And then it will do the right thing. It will be the last thing that is gathered. So that should still work. And by the way, oh yes, we are modifying this array. The implementations don't check this right now. Eventually they will, so it's probably good for you to say if you're modifying the arrays to make them read, write, or copies. So now it works with gather take. And I believe it works in Rakudo also. Yes? Okay. What else can we change here? Okay, well here's a little thing. We took that conditional out, the if add x in that other routine. So we know that routine returns nothing if you feed it nothing. So here we're feeding add x into strand, and then we're testing what comes back. But why are we testing? Why are we running it through strand in order to test whether it's empty? We could just test add x directly there. So let's just move the strand call down to here, and then instead of all this, let's just test while add x. And that's much cleaner. And we can swap this around. Since it's so simple, let's just make it a... You notice that's easier in Perl 6 because we got rid of the parens, so you don't have to remove the parens when you turn it into a statement modifier. Now, you'd like to think about this temporary variable, but we're modifying it each time through the loop in terms of itself, so we can't really do that, unfortunately. Still works? Okay. Well, what else? Well, you know, another thing that we can do in Perl 6 is we can define our own operators. So maybe we want to have a merge operator. This might actually be built in someday because there's quite a few uses for it. So what if we had an infix operator called M that would merge the lists on both sides of it? How would we define that? Well, instead of actually having a merge routine here, we would write it as like this, as infix capital M, and that automatically defines a new operator. Now this is one of those things, a lot of what I've showed you, some of it is going to come back into Perl 5. Perl 5 is continuing to develop along with Perl 6, and it is borrowing back the ideas that it can. And this is one of those ideas that might come back to Perl 5. So you might actually be able to do this in Perl 5 even without switching to Perl 6 someday. So if we define that as an infix operator like that, it still works. Now, what else can we do about that? Oh look, that's kind of like that variable equals variable operator something. Does that remind you of anything? Like you could write it like this? I mean, it's a user-defined operator. I shouldn't be able to turn it into an assignment operator, right? Well, yeah, sure I can. Why not? Okay, anything else stylistic here we can clean up in the last few minutes? Okay, here we have failure of parallelism. We have no parens here and we have parens here, and that's a little bit ugly. So if we turn these into the method form, then we can make them all the same. And you don't need those parens. Okay, are there any others that we can do that to? Let's see, that's splice. Could be a method on the array. So let's make it a method on the array. Okay. And are there any others? Let's see any offhand. Okay. And that still works. So, I want to show you that all this stuff is, you know, it works. The Perl 6, it's not as fast as Perl 5 yet, but someday it might be. But a lot of the stuff that makes Perl 6 a better Perl 5 works. And many of the things, as I said, that are in Perl 6, those ideas are also going to leak back and be retrofitted into Perl 5 and make that a much nicer language as well. So, you know, this is, for a few years after we started designing Perl 6, we thought, well, you know, Perl 6 will just supersede Perl 5, and Perl 5 will be like Perl 4. But in the years after that, we figured out, no, Perl 5 is a really good language, and it's going to last a long time. So we want to keep it going. We also want Perl 6. So we'll just do both. That's sort of the Perl way. There's more than one way to do it. So, mirai ni isho ni paru roku to paru go ikimasu. Yo. はい。ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございました。じゃあ質問がある方、
お疲れ様でした。
お疲れ様でした。
質問がある方いらっしゃいましたら手を挙げていただけると。
Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting, and I found the Haskell programming language And I see the similarity between the PowerShell and the Haskell. For example, in fixed operator, and the increase, decrease the same. So this data is very similar to the algebraic data type in Haskell. And I'm curious about the static kind of type checker or static checker in PowerShell, which may protect us from the very trivial error. So would you introduce some static checker or static type checker in PowerShell that protect the programmer from trivial error?
今の質問が分からなかった。分かったかねみんな。ごめんなさい。はい。パール6でハスキルみたいなスタティックの、タイプチェッカーを、入れる予定はありますかというんですね。あとです。
そんな感じ。
はい。っていう質問です。はい。
I almost understood the second better than the first. But yeah, it will be possible. I don't know whether Haskell's type checker is very strict. And if I made Perl 6 to be as strict as Haskell, most of you would hate it.
Sorry, I mean not the static type checker, but for example, if you omit the line with decrease here, so will you get a compilation error or not? If you delete the decrease line, so if the case statement or switch statement becomes not exclusive, then will you get a compilation error from the such kind of error? I mean, not the static type checker.
まあ、まずバリーが言ったのは、パールでも可能でしょうけれども、ハスケルみたいに、ハスケルはとてもいろいろ制限が必要な言語なので、そういうふうにした場合は皆さんパール6の大事になると思いますという答えでした。で、その後はよく分かりませんでした。もしこの when decrease をどうしたら
decrease を消したら
消した場合に、それはコンパイルエラーになるのかという質問です。Did you get the question? Basically, so if you delete the when decrease clause, would it be a compile time error if you were to introduce some sort of static?
It might. We haven't thought about that part of it yet. It might at least be a warning. It doesn't do that yet. Okay, but it would be easy. In terms of these kinds of type checking and errors, we do a lot we do make a lot of errors that we try to make very helpful. So that's likely to be one of them. We just haven't done that one yet. We're still figuring out the exact semantics of enums, but the type checking that we do want to put in will be the helpful kind, like that. Not the kind that makes you need a PhD in computer science in order to figure out your own program. So yeah, that sounds like a good thing to do to me. And if you want to translate that.
現段階ではエラーを出すということはないですけれども、あとそこまでまだ考えていないで、やるとしたらとりあえず警告ぐらい出るようになるんじゃないかな。あと基本的にはユーザーにとってユーザーフレンドリーなそういった警告やエラーを出す予定ではいますし、それは今言われたことはなかなかいい、例だとは思いますが、根本的にPhD がないとわからないようなシンタックスとかそういうものを作るつもりなくて、とにかく現実的に有用なものをやる予定です。
The other thing I want to say about type systems and lots of, there are many computer languages in the world and they all think they're perfect. With Perl 6, we are trying not to get perfect, but to get right next to perfect, so that somebody in the next generation can make it perfect.
いろんな言語があっていろんな型の、システムとかありますけども、パール6はこれで完璧なシステムを目指すんじゃなくて、完璧に近づこうとはしています。ただ将来的にはまた誰かがいろんな改善をしてくれる余地を残していくような形でやっていくつもりです。
So we make it possible to talk about an enumerated type, like increase, decrease, and same, but we don't necessarily have all the semantics and the error messages that would be best for that yet.
だからこういった今言われたenumerableタイプの型とかをさらに突っ込む余裕は残しているものをまだそこまで全部細かく仕様を決めているわけではありません。要は改善の余地を残している形で作っています。
But on many levels, Perl 6 is designed to evolve into a better language by declaration. You could say, use Ruby if you thought that was a perfect language.
パール6は、とりあえず改善の余地、進化していけるように、デザインされているので、ひょっとしたらどっか言語中に use Ruby って入れてできるようになるかもしれない。
I guess we're out of time.
じゃあ時間いっぱいなんで、すみません、これで終了で。ありがとうございました。